Go ahead and cast a casual glance down at your hand at this very moment. Whatever particular shade it happens to be, whether you are delightfully pale enough to be mistaken for a blank sheet of office paper, or beautifully dark enough to absorb incoming sunlight like an advanced, high-efficiency solar panel, that unique coloration of yours certainly did not just materialize out of thin air. No, it is the direct result of one of the longest, strangest, and most theatrical cosmetic makeovers in the entire geological history of life on Earth. And the absolute wildest part of this grand tale? It was not a random roll of the dice. It was not some clumsy biological accident. It was not some whimsical cosmic lottery. It was, in truth, an epic survival saga. A grueling, slow-motion physiological negotiation between your distant ancestors and the sun itself. And the sun, just for the record, was absolutely undeviatingly not playing fair. But what on earth actually happened? The convoluted answer involves a chaotic mixture of vitamin D, aggressive cancers, vital folate, the vast landscapes of Africa, frozen ice ages, clueless ancient farmers who inadvertently rewired their own genetic evolution, and a spectacularly rude, burning star sitting a casual 93 million miles away from us that caused this entire evolutionary circus and feels absolutely no remorse. If you painstakingly trace your tangled human family tree all the way back to its very roots, every single solitary one of your ancestors, completely regardless of where you currently reside on this big blue marble today, possessed deep dark skin. Every single one of them, not just most of them, not even a vast majority, every last one. Approximately 300,000 years ago, when the very first Homo sapiens began awkwardly wandering around Africa, the entire human species was uniformly dark-skinned. There were absolutely no pale folks. There was not a single fair-skinned population to be found anywhere on the face of the planet. The very concept of light skin had not even crossed humanity's mind yet. Now, just pause and ponder that mind-boggling fact for a brief second. Every single historical figure you have ever stared at in a dusty history textbook, every grand ancient civilization, every elaborate mythology, every primitive cave painting, literally all of it, traces its origins back to a single, tight-knit founding population that looked absolutely nothing like a very substantial portion of the modern human species. This means that at some critical juncture in our shared history, something monumental happened. Something dramatically changed. And that profound change was so incredibly powerful, so deeply etched into our very DNA, that it completely reshaped the physical appearance of entire populations across multiple continents over tens of thousands of years. So what exactly was this mysterious catalyst? Well, before we dive headfirst into that, we truly need to understand a few basic facts about skin itself. Because the truth is, the vast majority of people have absolutely no earthly idea what skin actually is, or what marvels it is actively performing for you at this very microsecond. A shocking number of people treat their skin as if it were mere biological shrink wrap. Like it is just a convenient, waterproof bag that your body came packaged in. A mundane wrapping designed solely to hold your squishy internal organs together while you walk around furiously arguing with total strangers on the internet. But skin is, in reality, a complex, living organ. It is, in fact, your absolute largest organ. And it is currently juggling about 47 entirely different jobs simultaneously with supreme efficiency, most of which you never even bother to think about, let alone thank it for. One of those vital jobs, and arguably one of the most critically important, is defending your delicate interior from harsh ultraviolet radiation. This UV radiation is a stream of invisible, high-energy particles that the sun relentlessly fires at Earth like an angry cosmic machine gun, and let me assure you, it is absolutely not your friend. UV light joyfully breaks fragile chemical bonds, ruthlessly damages your precious DNA, and triggers chaotic mutations in your unsuspecting cells. And if those cellular mutations are allowed to pile up in the wrong genetic places over a long enough period of time, they inevitably mutate into deadly cancers. Specifically, it leads to melanoma, which happens to be one of the most terrifyingly aggressive and fast-moving forms of skin cancer in existence. Now, this is the precise moment where your skin color becomes incredibly relevant. The natural pigment that graciously gives your skin its distinct hue is called melanin. And melanin is, in the most literal, no-nonsense biological sense, a premium sunscreen. It is a natural, built-in, always-on, molecular UV umbrella. The more melanin your skin naturally contains, the darker it inevitably appears to the eye. And, consequently, the more effectively it blocks those hostile UV rays from violently penetrating into the deeper, highly sensitive layers of tissue where your precious DNA resides. Dark skin is not merely an aesthetic look. It is a highly advanced biological shield. This explains precisely why in ancient Africa, where our fragile species first originated, sitting directly beneath some of the most scorching, intense, and unforgiving UV radiation on the entire planet, Mother Nature and evolution selected incredibly hard and remarkably fast for dark skin. Having an abundance of melanin meant your delicate DNA was vastly better protected. It meant you were significantly less likely to accumulate devastating, cancer-causing mutations. It meant you lived a much longer life, remained far healthier, and, most crucially of all from the chillingly cold, fiercely calculating perspective of evolution, we were far more likely to successfully survive long enough to reproduce and triumphantly pass your hard-earned genes down to the next bewildered generation. Natural selection, you see, is essentially a painfully slow, utterly ruthless optimization algorithm. It does not care one bit about modern aesthetics, it holds absolutely no opinions regarding subjective beauty, and it certainly does not wake up in the morning with an inspiring artistic vision of what the human species should ideally look like. Instead, it mindlessly runs one cold, binary calculation over and over and over again, billions of times across billions of oblivious organisms. Does the specific trait help you survive just long enough to have offspring? If the answer is yes, it enthusiastically keeps it. If the answer is no, it swiftly and mercilessly eliminates it. In equatorial Africa, directly under that relentlessly blazing, unforgiving sun, dark skin was a hard, incredibly emphatic yes. Every single generation, every single time. But here is the fascinating twist, and this is where our grand biological story gets genuinely, unexpectedly, and deliciously complicated. As it turns out, intense UV radiation does not just aggressively attack your skin cells. It also secretly assaults something else inside your body. Something incredibly small, completely invisible, and critically important. Something that, if you accidentally destroy it in the wrong person at the absolute wrong moment, can tragically end a pregnancy before it even has a chance to properly begin. The precious molecule in question is called folate. It is a highly vital form of vitamin B9, and it constantly flows through your bloodstream, quietly doing essential, behind-the-scenes biological maintenance work. Now, you might be casually thinking, okay, vitamin B, that sounds like that boring stuff my well-meaning doctor told me to eat more of. But why on earth does this matter so much for skin color? It matters enormously, especially if you happen to be pregnant or are actively trying to become pregnant. Folate is absolutely critical for the delicate development of the neural tube in growing embryos. The neural tube is the primary structure that eventually, miraculously becomes the brain and spinal cord. Without a sufficient supply of folate in those incredibly fragile first few weeks of pregnancy, sometimes quite inconveniently, before a woman even realizes she is actually pregnant, the neural tube can disastrously fail to close properly. The consequences of this failure are nothing short of catastrophic. Severe developmental abnormalities, tragic miscarriages, and devastating neural tube defects. Now, here lies the colossal problem. UV radiation absolutely obliterates folate. When intense UV light penetrates the skin and successfully reaches the bloodstream, it actively breaks down those fragile folate molecules. And in a perpetually sun-drenched environment like ancestral equatorial Africa, where there was absolutely no clothing, no cozy shelter, and certainly no SPF 50 sunscreen, UV exposure was constant, intense, and completely unavoidable. This unavoidable exposure created an additional, utterly devastating selection pressure. Pregnant women with slightly lighter skin, possessing less protective melanin, thus allowing more UV rays to penetrate deeper, suffered from much higher rates of tragic folate destruction. Higher rates of folate destruction naturally meant higher rates of developmental neural tube defects. Higher rates of these defects inevitably meant fewer surviving, healthy offspring to carry on the family name. So, now we suddenly have not just one, but two completely independent, incredibly powerful reasons why dark skin was deeply, non-negotiably, and fiercely favored under the burning African sun. First, melanin diligently protected DNA from nasty UV damage, thereby reducing cancer risks. Second, melanin carefully shielded folate in pregnant women, successfully preserving reproductive triumph. Two distinct, terrifying threats, solved by one elegant biological solution. Dark skin in Africa was not just mildly useful. It was essentially, unconditionally mandatory for the very survival of the human species. Okay, so dark skin is this magnificent, multi-purpose biological superweapon. It blocks cancer, it protects folate, and it has been rigorously field-tested and optimized over hundreds of thousands of grueling years. If evolution had an online review system, dark skin would easily boast a perfect 5-star rating with millions of glowing, highly enthusiastic testimonials. So why, in the name of everything remotely logical, did it ever change? Why did the adventurous populations that eventually left Africa end up getting lighter and lighter over thousands of tedious years? The answer lies in one of the most wonderfully elegant, yet brutally harsh trade-offs in the entire history of evolutionary biology. Between roughly 70,000 and 100,000 years ago, small, brave groups of Homo sapiens began cautiously leaving Africa. It certainly was not a single, highly dramatic event. No one organized a massive town hall meeting. No one loudly announced a great historical migration. It was simply a very slow, completely accidental generational drift. A tiny group happily moves just a little bit further than their parents did. Their children, feeling adventurous, move a little further still. Over thousands of years, our intrepid ancestors spread rather haphazardly through the vast Middle East, trekked into chilly Europe, wandered across Asia, and eventually made their grand, freezing entrance into the Americas. And as they stubbornly migrated further north, something absolutely fundamental about their cozy environment changed. The sun, quite frankly, got weaker. Well, not the sun itself, of course. That roaring celestial ball of thermonuclear gas remained exactly as gloriously indifferent and fiercely nuclear as it had always been. But at those ridiculously high latitudes, sunlight hits our round Earth at a painfully low, slanted angle. It has to struggle through vastly more thick atmosphere before it ever reaches your shivering skin. As a result, precious UV radiation is filtered out. Days become comically short, winters grow depressingly long and dark, and the sky remains stubbornly overcast for months on end. In northern Europe, in northern Asia, and up in chilly Canada, the UV environment is radically, indeed quite dramatically, different from the sun-drenched equatorial cradle of Africa. Instead of relentlessly intense, skin-scorching radiation that you absolutely need to block with all your might, you now have weak, highly intermittent radiation that you desperately, almost pitifully, need to absorb. And suddenly, that gorgeous dark skin that was so utterly perfect in Africa became a bit of a catastrophic problem. Not because of skin cancer, mind you. The actual cancer risk at those gloomy northern latitudes with such weak UV was beautifully, wonderfully low. And it wasn't because of folate either. Less UV naturally meant less tragic folate destruction, so that part of the biological equation was perfectly fine. No, the real culprit was something entirely different. Something that sadly doesn't get nearly enough glittering credit in this grand evolutionary story. The notorious vitamin D. You see, vitamin D is meticulously synthesized in the skin when UVB radiation hits a fancy chemical compound called 7-dehydrocholesterol. Your skin is, quite literally, an organic solar panel. It enthusiastically uses sunlight as an energy source to manufacture this absolutely essential, life-sustaining molecule. And vitamin D is most certainly not optional. Not even a tiny, negligible bit. It is completely, indisputably fundamental to basic human survival. Among its many talents, vitamin D strictly regulates calcium and phosphorus absorption in your gut. Without its helpful guidance, calcium doesn't get properly absorbed into your system, absolutely regardless of how many gallons of wholesome dairy you desperately consume. And without calcium, your bones simply refuse to mineralize correctly. In children, a severe lack of vitamin D causes rickets, a truly dreadful disease that softens and deforms the growing bones, bowing the poor legs outward, flattening the skull, and severely stunting their growth. In adult women, This same deficiency can cause a painful condition called osteomalacia, which silently softens the sturdy pelvic bones. And as you can imagine, softer, deformed pelvic bones make the already monumental task of childbirth extraordinarily dangerous, and sometimes altogether impossible. Women suffering from severe vitamin D deficiency face dramatically higher rates of mortality during the agony of labor. But vitamin D's dramatic deficiency doesn't just stop at wrecking the skeleton. It also severely impairs immune function, leaving you horribly susceptible to various nasty infections. It negatively affects muscle strength, compromises cardiovascular health, and some rather gloomy research even links chronic deficiency directly to depression and cognitive decline. Vitamin D performs so much heavy biological lifting that when you run out of it, the human body basically starts failing in multiple major systems simultaneously, like a poorly maintained amusement park. Now, let us hypothetically place a dark-skinned person in Northern Europe about 40,000 years ago. They possess highly efficient, wonderfully protective melanin. Their skin blocks dangerous UV radiation beautifully, which, again, was a brilliant survival strategy back home in Africa. But in the endlessly gray, dreadfully overcast, low-light north, that exact same protective melanin is now tragically blocking the very sliver of UV they desperately need to synthesize their precious vitamin D. Their skin, bless its simple heart, cannot tell the difference between dangerous UV I must block at all costs and useful UV I desperately need right now. It just blindly blocks everything. Consequently, they fail to make nearly enough vitamin D. Their calcium absorption plummets, their structural bones weaken, their children sadly develop rickets, and women perish in childbirth. Slowly but surely, the population begins to decline. Having dark skin in those chilly northern latitudes wasn't just a minor inconvenience. In a harsh, pre-industrial world with absolutely no vitamin supplements, no scientifically fortified foods, and no modern medical interventions, it was practically a slow-motion death sentence stretched mercilessly across generations. And so, evolution, that cold, merciless, endlessly patient cosmic calculator, started quietly but firmly selecting against it. Random mutations that conveniently reduced melanin production began popping up in the population. Quite randomly, of course, as genetic mutations always do. But instead of being swiftly eliminated by natural selection, these lighter skin mutations actually spread. Why? Because individuals with slightly lighter skin could synthesize slightly more vital vitamin D, possessed slightly healthier bones, and consequently enjoyed a slightly higher rate of reproductive success. Generation after generation, agonizingly slowly but surely, becoming slightly lighter, and yet slightly lighter still. Over vast spans of thousands of years, the average skin tone of these chilly northern populations drifted steadily upward. This wasn't because of some ancient, highly fashion-forward committee deciding pale was the new black, nor was it driven by fleeting cultural preferences or sophisticated social forces. No, it was purely because in that brutally specific environment, at that exact sun-starved latitude, with that frustratingly meager amount of sunlight, lighter skin quite simply kept more people alive. The cold, logical algorithm of evolution had simply reversed its inputs, swapping sunblock for solar panels. For a very long time, well-meaning scientists confidently assumed that the depigmentation of European populations was a painfully gradual affair, unfolding languidly over hundreds of thousands of years. They pictured a slow, incredibly steady evolutionary drift as prehistoric people casually strolled northward. However, recent ancient DNA analysis has completely and spectacularly demolished that comfortable assumption, replacing it with something infinitely more dramatic and far more interesting. It turns out that those early European hunter-gatherers, the rugged pioneers who stubbornly resided in Europe for tens of thousands of years after their initial epic migration out of Africa, were still undeniably and significantly dark-skinned. Even after chilling out at gloomy northern latitudes for a very long time, they hadn't dramatically bleached out at all. The absolute superstar example of this is a legendary ancient specimen known rather delightfully as Cheddar Man. This ancient fellow lived in what we now call Britain approximately 10,000 years ago. When geneticists published a groundbreaking ancient DNA analysis in 2018, they revealed that Cheddar Man likely possessed strikingly dark to medium-dark skin, wonderfully curly dark hair, and piercing blue eyes. It is a striking aesthetic combination that looks almost delightfully paradoxical to modern eyes, mainly because we modern humans have lazily come to associate icy blue eyes with extremely pale, sun-fearing skin. But back then, 10,000 years ago, that simply wasn't the biological rulebook. The spectacularly fair, almost translucent skin we so easily associate with Northwestern Europeans today, the delicate kind that tragically burns to a crisp in about 12 minutes of mild summer sun, actually appears to have spread widely across European populations only within roughly the last 6,000 to 8,000 years. Let that sink in. That is shockingly, almost unbelievably recent. In the grand, sprawling 300,000-year history of our species, Homo sapiens, that represents a mere blink of an eye, less than the final 3% of our existence. So, what on earth happened between 6,000 and 8,000 years ago that suddenly slammed the evolutionary gas pedal and accelerated this bleaching process so dramatically? The answer lies in one of the most monumental, world-altering transitions in all of human history, yet almost nobody ever talks about its bizarrely direct effect on skin color. Behold the Neolithic Revolution, the monumental switch from wild hunting and gathering to organized farming. When humans foolishly or wisely transitioned to agriculture, their daily diet changed completely, utterly, and permanently. Before this, those carefree hunter-gatherers enjoyed a wonderfully varied, gourmet wild diet that naturally packed significant, healthy doses of vitamin D. They feasted on delicious fatty fish like salmon and mackerel, nutrient-dense organ meats like liver and kidney, plump shellfish, and other rich animal products that happen to be among the absolute gold standard dietary sources of vitamin D in existence. But the New Age farming populations? They suddenly ate mostly boring cereals, endless bowls of wheat, barley, oats, rye, and starchy carbohydrates. Their dietary vitamin D intake didn't just experience a polite dip. It catastrophically collapsed off a cliff. Suddenly, human populations that had previously been getting by perfectly well with modest amounts of UV-synthesized vitamin D, largely because their rich diets were happily picking up the slack, found themselves almost entirely and desperately dependent on whatever meager amounts of the vitamin their own skin could photosynthesize. And if their skin was still fairly dark, that sluggish production simply wasn't enough to cut it anymore. Consequently, the harsh selection pressure for lighter skin intensified dramatically. Even tiny, seemingly insignificant increases in vitamin D synthesis ability, even possessing a marginally smaller amount of sun-blocking melanin, suddenly became a critically urgent matter of life and death. But wait, there is a second, equally sneaky factor that made this pale revolution happen at breakneck speed. Farming communities were remarkably large, densely packed, and highly sedentary. As it turns out, sheer population size and density have absolutely enormous, mathematically beautiful effects on how quickly a trendy, advantageous mutation can spread through a local gene pool. In a tiny, scattered, and highly suspicious hunter-gatherer band of about 50 people, a shiny new beneficial mutation might take an agonizingly long time to awkwardly introduce itself to neighboring groups. Conversely, in a bustling farming village of hundreds, closely connected to a sprawling network of other farming villages, a beneficial genetic mutation can effortlessly sweep through thousands of eager descendants in just a handful of generations. This perfect storm of a catastrophic dietary vitamin D collapse combined with cozy high-density living essentially hit the cosmic fast-forward button on European depigmentation, turning a slow evolutionary crawl into a frantic sprint toward paleness. And so, within a mere handful of millennia, the evolutionary pressure that had spent tens of thousands of years gently, almost politely nudging human skin tones toward the lighter end of the spectrum suddenly panicked. It became intensely frantic, ridiculously rapid, and aggressively obvious in the dusty archaeological record. Now, prepare to have your mind mildly blown, because here is a little biological secret that genuinely startles most well-meaning people when they first stumble across it. Skin color is absolutely not controlled by some simplistic, single, lonely gene. There is no magical dark skin gene fighting a valiant duel against a light skin gene, where one triumphantly dominates the other in a neat high school biology square. Oh no, Mother Nature enjoys being far more deliciously complicated than that. In reality, skin pigmentation is what we call a highly complex polygenic trait. It is meticulously controlled by dozens of different, highly opinionated genes gossiping and working together in a genetic committee. We are talking about genes that micromanage exactly how much melanin is produced, which specific type of melanin is brewed, how those tiny melanin granules are strategically packed and distributed inside your skin cells, and precisely how your epidermis reacts to harsh UV exposure over decades of sunbathing. And here is the truly exquisite, mind-boggling kicker. Different human populations that independently decided to evolve lighter skin did not actually use the same genetic instruction manual to pull it off. East Asians and Europeans, as we know, both possess significantly lighter skin than equatorial Africans. Yet, the genetic variants responsible for this pale upgrade in East Asians are almost entirely different from the variants doing the heavy lifting in Europeans. They arrived at essentially the same aesthetic destination by taking wildly different molecular scenic routes. Scientists, in their infinite love for fancy labels, call this convergent evolution. It is the exact same survival hack: lighter skin in gloomily low UV environments, discovered completely independently through totally different genetic pathways by entirely separate populations lounging on entirely separate continents. Think about the sheer, staggering magnitude of what that actually means. The evolutionary whip was cracking so hard, so relentlessly, and so unambiguously that natural selection solved the exact same puzzle multiple times. Not once, not twice, but multiple times, entirely on its own, without copying anyone else's homework. When evolution keeps stubbornly reinventing the exact same wheel from scratch, that is about as loud and dramatic a biological signal as you will ever get that the trait in question is not just a fashion statement, but something that really, truly, life or death matters for survival. While we are wandering around this fascinating genetic neighborhood, let us take a quick detour to talk about something adjacent that is equally, if not more, mind-bending: those dazzling blue eyes. Prepare yourselves, because every single living person on Earth today with blue eyes, yes, every single one, absolutely no exceptions, is descended from one highly specific, incredibly trend-setting individual. One solitary person, one random genetic glitch, one quiet moment of chromosomal luck somewhere around the misty Black Sea region, roughly 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. Before that fortunate soul was born into the world, the entire human species possessed exclusively brown eyes. Everyone. Rich brown, dark brown, nothing but brown as far back as your imagination can travel. Then, this one singular mutation popped up, a tiny, rebellious change that dramatically choked back melanin production specifically in the iris, and lo and behold, it spread. It started off slowly, as fashion trends do, and then picked up serious speed, likely because it was genetically hitchhiking alongside those useful skin pigmentation variants that were themselves under incredibly intense evolutionary selection. Now, pause for a moment to contemplate this delicious irony. Something we modern humans view as deeply ancient, poetic, and fundamental to our identity as blue eyes. Something that has been used to categorize, romanticize, and unfortunately sort human beings into arbitrary boxes throughout history, is actually younger than the very invention of agriculture. It is younger than the mysterious stones of Stonehenge. It is younger than the first brave human who looked at a wild horse and decided to ride it. We stubbornly treat certain human physical traits as primordial and ancient when, in geological or evolutionary terms, they are basically fresh out of the box, smelling of new paint. The version of humanity we smugly think of as normal, finalized, and clears throat permanently fixed is still very much a messy first draft being actively rewritten. Let us take a wise step back and look at the grand, sweeping picture here. Skin color. The single, superficial characteristic that has tragically defined so much of turbulent human history, shaped clumsy political systems, excused unspeakable atrocities, and divided and sorted human beings into ridiculous, artificial hierarchies for thousands of years is, at its cold biological core, nothing more than a glorified UV calibration system. It is quite literally a thermostat, an elegant, automatic dial. It is merely your body's best, long-term ancestral guess of exactly how much solar radiation shielding you require, based entirely on the latitude your distant ancestors happen to wander into, the specific diet they managed to scrape together, and the amount of sunshine they happen to sleep under. Light skin is not superior in any absolute, grand cosmic sense. In hot, equatorial environments, it is actually a walking health hazard. It means dangerously high UV penetration, catastrophic DNA damage, skyrocketing cancer risks, and the swift, disastrous destruction of vital folate. Consequently, sporting pale, ghostly skin in the blazing heart of Africa is a spectacular survival disadvantage. Rich, dark skin isn't somehow less evolved or primitive. It is, in fact, the ultimate ancestral masterpiece. It is the glorious original factory setting, the pristine baseline from which every other shade is merely a frantic, late-stage modification. If anything, lighter skin is simply the trendy, newer software update, the quirky adaptation, the regional variation. Dark skin remains the classic default, and the delightfully deepest irony of all is this. The very same fiery sun that bullied some human populations into developing heavy layers of protective melanin to survive its scorching power also gently nudged other chilly populations to shed that melanin because they desperately needed to squeeze out every drop of its limited, gloomy winter energy. The sun, you see, didn't pick political sides, possessed absolutely no personal preferences. It just blazed on with magnificent cosmic indifference, leaving lazy old natural selection to sort out the messy details. And yet, in our infinite wisdom, we stupidly built an entire global civilization's worth of ugly prejudice, brutal oppression, and silly social hierarchies around what is essentially a minor vitamin D deficiency, a trivial calcium absorption issue, and a basic housekeeping folate protection mechanism. Astonishingly, human populations are still actively evolving. It happens painstakingly slowly, almost entirely imperceptibly on our fleeting, fragile individual lifespans, but we are undeniably chugging along the evolutionary highway nonetheless. The relentless evolutionary pressures that once strictly shaped our skin colors are still lurking in the background, even if our brilliant modern technology has successfully thrown a heavy wet blanket over them. We now have tiny vitamin D gummies. We have messy bottles of sunscreen. We enjoy chemically fortified breakfast cereals, blinding electric lighting, cozy heated houses, and delightfully unnatural year-round access to fresh papayas harvested from any latitude on the globe. We have proudly constructed a bizarrely complex civilization that has successfully, if partially, decoupled our fragile skin biology from its raw, original survival function. The grand evolutionary algorithm is still running silently in the background, but we have wildly scrambled the data inputs. Quite frankly, what this chaotic cosmic experiment means for the human species over the next 100,000 years is anyone's guess. Regrettably, Mother Nature doesn't send out weekly email newsletters, but we can state with absolute, undeniable confidence that every single beautiful shade of human skin gracing the earth today is the direct product of that very same ancient family reunion standing under the hot African sun, slowly wandering across a wildly unpredictable planet, and carrying, lovingly inscribed in their melanin, the remarkably precise travel journal of every harsh environment their adventurous descendants walked through. Ultimately, every unique skin tone is merely a brilliant answer to a very specific cosmic question asked by our local star, and delightfully enough, every single one of those answers was absolutely, undeniably correct.